The fate of 3 billion human souls hung on a delicate peace treaty. But the real crisis began the moment an alien monarch used a botanist's thighs as a pillow. It was a diplomatic disaster absolutely nobody had a contingency plan for. Elias Vance was not a diplomat, nor was he a soldier, a spy, or a hero. He was a xenobotanist, a man who preferred the predictable growth cycles of mutated ferns to the unpredictable egos of sentient beings. He was 34, running on 4 hours of sleep, and severely under-caffeinated. Earth's diplomatic corps had dragged him to the neutral station of Aegis Prime, simply because the Xylari Empire's homeworld was a toxic jungle of hyper-aggressive flora, and the Terran delegation wanted an expert on hand just in case agricultural trade became a bargaining chip. For 3 grueling days, it had not. Instead, Elias sat in the back row of the grand negotiation chamber, a sprawling amphitheater constructed of polished white stone and transparent aluminum. He spent his time mentally cataloging the ornamental plants lining the room to keep himself awake. He was seated in the lower tier, exactly eye level with the grand dais where the true powers of the galaxy clashed. The Xylari were terrifying. They were a bipedal reptilian-mammalian hybrid species, towering over humans at an average of 7 to 8 feet. Their culture was aggressively matriarchal, built on a foundation of martial supremacy and absolute unwavering discipline. They respected strength, despised weakness, and viewed humanity as a chaotic, squabbling species barely worth the effort of conquering. Leading the diplomatic assault for the Xylari was High Minister Vorek. Vorek was a mountain of indigo scales draped in ceremonial crimson silks, pacing the floor like a caged predator. He was currently delivering a blistering hour-long monologue about Earth's unauthorized mining operations near the neutral zone. His voice a deep, resonant rumble that shook the crystal glasses on the human delegation's table. Elias rubbed his temples, tuning out Vorek's posturing. His attention drifted to the center of the dais. Queen Sylth sat in absolute silence. She was a vision of lethal majesty. Unlike Vorek's ceremonial silks, the queen wore her authority like a weapon. She was clad in advanced biomechanical armor, a second skin of sleek obsidian metal interwoven with organic bioluminescent veins that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic violet light. The armor was rumored to be directly wired into her nervous system, enhancing her strength, speed, and cognitive processing to godlike levels. Her face, framed by a crest of dark, backward-sweeping ridges, was a mask of cold, calculating intelligence. She hadn't spoken a single word in 2 hours. She just watched the Terran diplomats sweat. Vorek slammed a heavy, clawed fist onto the negotiation table, cracking the polished surface. He demanded immediate territorial concessions, reparations, and the total dismantling of Earth's outer defense grid. The human ambassador, a seasoned politician named Eris Thorn, opened his mouth to offer a measured counter-proposal. Queen Sylth finally moved. She stood up. The entire chamber fell into an immediate, breathless silence. The sheer physical presence of the Xylari monarch was suffocating. Even Vorek stepped back, bowing his head in deference. The violet veins on her armor flared brightly. She raised a single armored hand to silence the room completely. She opened her mouth to deliver what was surely going to be a devastating ultimatum. The final word that would either secure peace or plunge 2 sectors of the galaxy into total war. Instead, a sharp metallic whine emanated from her armor, descending rapidly in pitch. The violet bioluminescence flickering across her obsidian plating sputtered, turned a sickly shade of gray, and abruptly died. Queen Sylth swayed. It was a microscopic movement, but for a creature of such absolute control, it was as shocking as a mountain suddenly shifting. Her golden eyes widened in a flash of pure, unadulterated confusion. Her knees buckled, The physics of the situation were tragically simple. The queen was standing at the very edge of the raised dais. Elias was sitting in the front row of the lower consultant tier, directly beneath her. When her armor locked up and her body went limp, gravity did the rest. She pitched forward, tumbling off the edge of the platform. Elias had exactly a fraction of a second to react. His brain processed the sight of nearly 400 pounds of apex predator and deadweight metal plummeting toward him. Survival instincts demanded he dive out of the way, but the seats were cramped, the aisle was blocked, and sheer paralytic shock pinned him to his chair. With a heavy, breath-stealing impact, Queen Sylth crashed directly into Elias. The world turned into a chaotic blur of dark metal, cold scales, and the scent of ozone and exotic spices. Elias was slammed back into his seat, the breath violently expelled from his lungs. The queen's head, crowned with its rigid crest, came to rest heavily against his chest, her face buried in the crook of his neck. The bulk of her armored torso sprawled across his lap, pinning his legs completely to the floor. For one agonizing second, Elias was convinced he was going to be crushed to death. But the reinforced chair held, and the queen stopped moving. Total, absolute silence slammed into the negotiation chamber. It was a silence so profound it possessed a physical weight. Elias, gasping for air, slowly opened his eyes. His hands, acting on a blind, instinctual need to brace himself, had somehow ended up resting awkwardly on the cold metal of the queen's back. He stared out over the top of her inert head, his vision swimming slightly from the impact. The room was frozen in a tableau of absolute horror. The human delegation stared with wide, unblinking eyes, their jaws entirely slack. Ambassador Thorne looked as if he were having a localized stroke. But it was the reaction of the Xylari Royal Guard that was truly spectacular. There were 12 of them stationed around the room, 12 8-foot-tall engines of destruction, hand-picked for their lethal efficiency and absolute devotion to the matriarch. They held kinetic rifles and halberds that hummed with contained plasma. They were trained to react to threats in milliseconds. They were conditioned to lay down their lives without a second thought. Right now, they were experiencing a catastrophic system failure of the mind. Their supreme ruler, the untouchable godlike entity they were sworn to protect with religious fervor, was currently draped across the lap of a terrified, rumpled human botanist like a sleeping house cat. Elias watched as the closest guard, a massive warrior scarred from countless battles, took a single aggressive step forward, raising his plasma halberd. Then, the guard abruptly stopped. His reptilian eyes darted frantically between the queen, Elias, and his commanding officer. He lowered the weapon an inch. He raised it again. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, his jaw working silently. They had contingency protocols for assassinations. They had protocols for orbital bombardments, chemical attacks, and full-scale invasions. They did not have a protocol for this. If they fired, they risked hitting the queen. If they physically grabbed the queen to pull her away, they would be committing the ultimate heresy of touching the royal personage without permission. If they killed the human, the queen might fall awkwardly to the floor, which was also a failure of their duty to protect her dignity. They were caught in an endless, paralyzing loop of tactical paradoxes. High Minister Vorek was the first to break the silence. His throat clicked, a sound of absolute disbelief, before his face contorted into an expression of raw, unhinged fury. He pointed a trembling, clawed finger directly at Elias. Elias swallowed hard, his throat dry. He didn't dare speak. He barely dared to breathe. The heavy, rhythmic breathing of the alien queen against his collarbone was the only proof she was even alive. As Elias sat frozen, terrified that a single twitch of his knee would result in a plasma bolt through his forehead, he noticed something strange. where his bare left hand was pressed against a gap in the queen's obsidian armor, right at the base of her spine. A faint pulsing light began to emanate. It was not the violet glow of her armor. It was a soft pale blue, spreading slowly beneath her pale scales, creeping outward from the point of physical contact with his skin. He didn't know what the light was, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The fate of the galaxy was no longer resting on a treaty. It was resting on his lap. A room full of highly trained, heavily armed apex predators is terrifying. A room full of heavily armed apex predators experiencing a collective blue screen of the mind is a uniquely volatile nightmare. Elias sat utterly paralyzed beneath 400 pounds of comatose alien royalty. The air in the negotiation chamber suddenly tasted of ozone and burnt copper as a dozen plasma halberds powered up, emitting a high-pitched, vibrating hum that rattled Elias right down to his teeth. Every single Zelari royal guard had their weapon trained on his general vicinity. Their golden, slit-pupiled eyes were blown wide with a volatile mixture of sheer rage and profound existential panic. Elias realized with horrifying clarity that if he shifted his weight, if he coughed, if he so much as twitched his left kneecap to relieve the crushing pressure on his femur, he would be instantly vaporized into a fine pink mist. His internal monologue was running at light speed, oscillating wildly between blind animal terror and the absurd, detached professionalism of a man who just wanted to go back to studying the cellular structure of mutated space ferns. He rapidly calculated the structural integrity of his lower body against the dead weight of the Queen's biomechanical armor. He concluded with grim certainty that both of his legs were going to fall completely numb long before the Terran diplomatic corps figured out how to extract him from this disaster. He also noted with a dark, hysterical irony that he was currently the most heavily protected human in the known galaxy, purely by virtue of being a very squishy, very terrified meat shield for the most powerful being in 3 star systems. "Do not move, human," High Minister Vorek roared, his voice shattering the fragile, terrifying silence of the room. Vorek's ceremonial crimson silks whipped around his massive frame like a blood-red storm as he descended the grand dais, his thick obsidian claws extending from his fingertips with a sickening, metallic sliding sound. "You have poisoned the matriarch." Elias desperately wanted to yell that he was just a botanist, that he didn't even know how to hold a standard-issue sidearm, let alone orchestrate the assassination of a galactic sovereign. But his vocal cords were utterly paralyzed. The rigid, backward-sweeping crest of the Queen's head was resting a mere inch from his jugular vein. He settled for breathing as shallowly as humanly possible, trying to shrink into the upholstery of his chair. Ambassador Thorne finally found his diplomatic voice, stepping forward from the Terran delegation's table with his hands raised high in a universal gesture of frantic surrender. "Minister Vorek, please listen to reason. Mr. Vance has been thoroughly scanned. We all have multiple times before entering this chamber. He carries no weapons. He carries no toxins. This is a massive misunderstanding." A Zelari medical technician, trembling so violently his indigo scales rattled audibly against his light chest armor, scurried forward carrying a heavy, cylindrical diagnostic scanner. He waved the device over the Queen's inert, armored form, making absolutely sure to keep a terrified, respectful distance from Elias's face. The scanner chirped loudly, emitting a rapid, discordant sequence of harsh tones that made the royal guards grip their weapons tighter. "Report the findings," Vorek snapped, looming over the diminutive technician like a physical shadow. "The matriarch is not dead, High Minister," the technician stammered, his eyes glued to the scrolling holographic readout. "Her core temperature is dropping at an unprecedented rate. She has entered the deep slumber. It is a total biological stasis." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the Xylari delegation. Vorek's eyes narrowed into dangerous, calculating slits. The deep slumber was not a simple fainting spell. It was a legendary Xylari biological defense mechanism. A final, desperate physiological attempt by the body to halt the spread of a catastrophic, lethal contaminant by shutting down all non-essential functions. A neurotoxin, Vorek declared, his deep voice booming with sudden theatrical authority, ensuring every diplomat and soldier in the vast amphitheater heard him clearly. Undetectable by our perimeter security, clearly delivered by this Terran assassin via proximity or touch. As High Minister and with the matriarch incapacitated, I hereby invoke the emergency succession protocols. Seize the human immediately. If you must cut through the matriarch's armor to tear her from his grasp, do so. Elias felt a cold, clammy sweat break out across his forehead and run down his neck. He was about to be executed on a political technicality, and his only defense was a postgraduate degree in agricultural science. He closed his eyes, bracing for the searing heat of a plasma blade. But the royal guards did not move. Their commanding officer, a towering, heavily scarred warrior named Kalen, stepped directly between Vorek and Elias. Kalen was a legend among his people, his armor scored with the ash and carbon scarring of a dozen conquered worlds. He did not raise his weapon against the High Minister, but his posture was a wall of absolute, immovable defiance. "Commander Kalen," Vorek hissed, his indigo scales flushing a dangerous, dark purple with mounting fury. "You dare defy a direct order from the acting sovereign of the Empire?" "The matriarch still breathes. Vorek," Kalen rumbled, his voice low, resonant, and sounding exactly like grinding tectonic plates. "And as long as she breathes, I observe her condition before taking action that might harm her." Kalen leaned closer to Elias, his golden slit-pupiled eyes focusing with intense, terrifying scrutiny. He was not looking at Elias's face. He was staring at the point where Elias's bare left hand was trapped against a narrow gap in the Queen's obsidian armor, right at the base of her spine. Elias had noticed the pale blue light earlier, a faint glimmer in the chaos now. It was undeniably bright. It was pulsing rhythmically, syncing perfectly with Elias's own terrified, racing heartbeat. The soft luminescence was spreading outward from Elias's skin, threading its way directly into the organic, biomechanical veins of the Queen's disabled armor. It pulsed warmly beneath her pale, exposed scales, a stark, vibrant contrast to the sickly dead gray her armor had turned upon her sudden collapse. The medical technician gasped sharply, frantically checking his scanner again and tapping the side of the device as if it were malfunctioning. "Commander, the stasis, it is stabilizing. The toxin's progression has halted completely, and the point of origin for the stabilization is clear." The technician swallowed hard, pointing a shaking, clawed finger directly at Elias's trapped hand. "It is the human. His specific biological signature, the trace elements on his skin, is somehow interacting with her armor's organic matrix and neutralizing the synaptic decay." Vorek's face contorted into a mask of ugly, naked desperation. "Impossible. It is a Terran trick, a secondary phase of the assassination. Kill him now." Kalen slowly turned his massive, crested head to glare directly into the High Minister's eyes. The unspoken threat in the commander's posture was loud enough to deafen the room. "The human's touch is keeping the Queen alive. Vorek, the scanner does not lie. If we sever the physical connection, the stasis will fail, and the toxin will complete its work. He stays exactly where he is." Elias let out a long, shaky breath he didn't even realize he was holding. Unfortunately, the simple act of exhaling caused his chest to expand, which jostled the Queen's heavy, armored head slightly against his collarbone. Instantly, a dozen plasma halberds whined at a much higher, lethal pitch, aiming squarely at his face. Elias froze entirely, turning into a statue, staring wide-eyed at Commander Kalen. He had earned a temporary reprieve from execution, but his reality remained a nightmare. He was still a hostage to a comatose, highly toxic alien monarch, surrounded by a room full of heavily armed, fiercely loyal bodyguards who were one twitch away from turning him to ash. He needed to figure out how a botanist from Ohio had become a living antidote, and he needed to do it quickly, before the High Minister decided a dead queen was more politically convenient than a saved one. Coming back from the deep slumber felt like swimming upward through an ocean of crushed glass. Queen Sylph tasted blood, ash, and the sharp metallic tang of absolute betrayal. She opened her golden eyes. The world was sideways, blurred at the edges and vibrating with an alien, frantic rhythm. It took her several agonizing seconds of cognitive rebooting to realize the rhythm was a terrified heartbeat, and the soft, yielding surface beneath her cheek was not a royal recovery bed, but a person, a Terran. Sylph attempted to shift her weight, to summon the godlike, augmented strength of her biomechanical armor, but her limbs felt like they were filled with wet sand. Her neural link to the suit was severely degraded, sputtering with static. This was a profound, terrifying vulnerability she had not experienced since she was a fledgling in the royal nurseries. She was sprawled across the human's lap, her rigid cranial crest resting precariously against his fragile collarbone. She could feel his chest hitching with panicked, shallow breaths. She shifted her armored shoulder an inch. Instantly, the collective hum of a dozen plasma halberds in the room spiked to a deafening pitch. Her optical sensors flickered back to life, projecting a chaotic, glitching stream of data directly into her visual cortex. Her internal medical diagnostics ran a brutal, rapid-fire assessment. Toxin identified whisper root extract. It was a synthesized botanical poison exclusively controlled by the highest echelon of the Xylari High Council. It was designed to bypass all known biofilters and trigger an immediate, irreversible neurological collapse. Vorek. The realization hit her with cold, crystalline clarity. Her own High Minister had orchestrated a public execution disguised as a diplomatic incident. But she was alive. The whisper root was universally fatal within 3 minutes of exposure, yet her heart was still pumping. Sylph traced a strange, burning sensation to the base of her spine. A pale blue light was bleeding from the Terran's bare hand directly into her armor's exposed neural mesh. She cross-referenced the data, the human's unique physiological composition, specifically the ambient amino acids and complex trace salts on his skin, was acting as an aggressive, wildly unpredictable binding agent. His touch was literally tearing the whisper root molecules apart at a cellular level. He was a living, breathing antidote, and his continued physical contact was the only thing standing between her and a gruesome death. Above them, the political theater was rapidly escalating into a violent coup. Vorek's booming voice echoed through the pristine negotiation chamber, laced with a desperate, venomous urgency. "Commander Kalen is compromised by Terran trickery," Vorek roared, gesturing wildly to a contingent of his own personal enforcers who had quietly filtered into the chamber during the chaos. They wore the dark crimson armor of the Ministry, and their weapons were raised, aimed squarely at Kalen's loyalists. "The Terran is dampening her life signs to prolong her suffering. In the name of the Empire, remove the human by force, sever the connection." Elias Vance watched the crimson-armored soldiers step forward, their kinetic rifles leveling at his chest. He was hyperventilating, his mind completely unable to process the sheer volume of lethal threats converging on his exact location. He braced himself for the searing impact of plasma fire. Then, the supposedly comatose alien monarch moved. A heavy, cold gauntlet snapped up with the force of an industrial vice, locking painfully around Elias's wrist. Elias choked on a gasp, his eyes widening in fresh horror. Sylth hoisted her torso up just enough to look him dead in the eye. Her golden irises were narrowed into predatory, glowing slits, burning with a fierce, calculating intellect that made his stomach plummet entirely. "Do not release me," she whispered. Her voice was a raspy, metallic hiss that bypassed his ears entirely and vibrated directly into the bones of his jaw. Before Elias could even begin to process the command, or the fact that the terrifying queen was speaking directly to him, Sylth reached out with her free hand. Her armored fingers slammed against a seemingly smooth, ornamental geometric panel on the base of the raised dais beside them. It was a royal failsafe, an architectural secret known only to the ruling matriarchs for generations. A hidden sequence of biometric locks instantly registered her genetic signature and the unique energy footprint of her armor. The polished white stone floor directly beneath Elias's chair dissolved with a harsh pneumatic hiss. Gravity abandoned them entirely. The pristine negotiation chamber, the shouting human diplomats, Vorek's enraged face, and the leveling plasma weapon simply vanished upward, replaced by a rushing, echoing vertical darkness. Elias yelled, a completely undignified, raw sound of pure terror. As his chair flipped backward into the sudden void, he flailed wildly, desperate to grab onto anything solid, but there was only empty air. Sylth's heavy, armored bulk dragged him downward like an anchor, her grip on his wrist completely unbreakable. The pale blue light connecting them flared brilliantly in the pitch blackness of the shaft, illuminating the rushing stone walls. They were plummeting into the forgotten belly of Aegis Prime. Beneath the shining modern diplomatic station lay an ancient, abandoned subterranean labyrinth built by the Xylari ancestors centuries ago. They were falling away from the light, leaving a catastrophic political bloodbath in their wake, and taking the only cure for a murdered queen straight into an abyss from which no one was meant to return. Falling into a sealed, forgotten abyss is generally a fatal career move for an Earth botanist. Surviving the impact only to remain physically tethered to a highly toxic, incredibly furious alien monarch is a completely different classification of disaster. The descent ended not with a lethal splat, but a bone-jarring slide down a heavily angled, frictionless offshoot chute. It deposited them violently into a cavernous space, burying them waist-deep in a mountain of decaying centuries-old moss. The reinforced diplomatic chair that Elias had been clinging to shattered into a dozen useless pieces upon impact. He rolled over, choking on stale air that tasted prominently of pulverized limestone and ancient rust. He scrambled frantically backward, desperate to put distance between himself and the danger. But his left wrist was still locked in Queen Sylth's unyielding, armored grip. The pale blue light bridging their skin flickered like a dying fluorescent tube, casting long, eerie shadows across the subterranean vault. Elias blinked the dust from his eyes and stared at their surroundings. Towering, monolithic pillars of dark, striated metal disappeared into a ceiling lost to absolute darkness. Vast, crumbling archways choked with pale, creeping vines stretched into the gloom. They were in the Undercity. This was the original, brutalist foundation of Aegis Prime. A sprawling technological crypt sealed away and left to rot long before the first human ever figured out faster-than-light travel. Sylth pushed herself up on one elbow, her biomechanical armor groaning in loud protest. The violet veins of light across her suit were completely dead now, leaving her encased in a massive, inert shell of heavy metal. She looked at Elias, her golden eyes flashing with a demanding imperial arrogance that was entirely unearned given her current posture in a pile of subterranean sludge. She opened her mouth and issued a sharp, authoritative command in flawless galactic standard, ordering him to stand immediately, elevate her communications relay, and prepare to act as her physical vanguard. Elias coughed violently, brushing glowing parasitic spores from his rumpled suit jacket. He took a deep breath, fighting down a wave of pure panic. and politely informed the supreme ruler of the Xylari Empire that he was a plant scientist with a bruised tailbone, not a pack mule. He added with a surprising amount of venom that if she wanted to survive the next 10 minutes, she needed to stop treating him like a disposable serf and let go of his arm. The sheer audacity of his refusal short-circuited her royal brain for a solid 5 seconds. Sylth was accustomed to absolute unquestioning obedience. Having a fragile, squishy human lecture her on pragmatism while they were both covered in ancient dirt was a cultural shock she was entirely unprepared for. Her scaled brow furrowed, a low, dangerous rumble building in her chest as she prepared to educate the Terran on the exact penalty for insubordination. Before she could formulate a sufficiently lethal reprimand, the shadows shifted. A harsh, grinding, metallic wail echoed through the cavern, vibrating against the stone walls. In the gloom behind a fallen pillar, a trio of red optical sensors ignited. 3 ancient Xylari security drones drifted into the pale blue light. They were floating geometric shapes of corroded copper and jagged edges, relics of a paranoid era, programmed by a forgotten algorithm to sterilize any unauthorized biological presence in the catacombs. Their targeting lasers painted erratic crimson lines across Elias's chest and the Queen's inert armor. Sylth attempted to raise her right arm to deploy a concussive plasma blast, her combat instincts taking over completely. But her suit's power reserves had been entirely drained by the whisper root toxin and the subsequent biological stasis. The weapon port merely clicked weakly, spinning a dead cylinder. Elias did not have a concussive blast. He had a highly observant, academically trained brain and a deep, encyclopedic understanding of parasitic ecosystems. He noticed the thick, pale vines clinging to the ceiling directly above the floating drones. They were heavily swollen, weeping a highly caustic, glowing sap that had already eaten through solid rock in several places on the floor. As the drones charged up their ancient, sputtering energy weapons, Elias did not freeze. He grabbed a heavy chunk of the shattered diplomatic chair with his free hand, gauged the trajectory, and hurled it upward with frantic, adrenaline-fueled precision. The debris smashed violently into the central cluster of the swollen vines. A torrential downpour of highly corrosive, bioluminescent acid rained down squarely onto the malfunctioning drones beneath. Their rusted chassis dissolved in a matter of seconds. The acid chewed through their power cores, causing them to spark violently before collapsing onto the stone floor as piles of smoking, melted slag. Queen Sylth stared at the smoldering wreckage. She slowly turned her golden eyes to the breathless, trembling human attached to her wrist. He had not used a blade or a blaster. He had weaponized the local flora. It was a deeply dishonorable, completely underhanded tactic that violated every tenet of Xylari martial pride. It was also undeniably effective. She felt a strange, unfamiliar emotion warring with her ingrained prejudice. It was a begrudging, undeniable respect. Their momentary relief was shattered by a low, guttural hiss from the perimeter of the light. The sharp scent of the acid and the violent energy discharge of the dying drones had awakened something else. A pack of 6-legged subterranean predators slinked into the clearing. They were entirely blind, their smooth, pale heads dominated by massive, serrated mandibles that dripped with a viscous, dark fluid. They moved with terrifying fluid coordination, fanning out to encircle their prey. Elias felt a cold spike of pure, unadulterated terror pierce his chest. He was a dead man. But strangely, his panic was instantly followed by a wave of furious, cold calculation that was entirely alien to his own mind. He looked down at his trapped wrist. The blue light connecting him to Sylth was surging, burning brighter than ever, illuminating the veins in his forearm. He was not just neutralizing her poison anymore. He was feeling her. He felt the heavy, phantom weight of her dead armor restricting his own movements. He felt the sharp, lingering ache of the whisper root toxin fighting a losing battle in her bloodstream. Most overwhelmingly, he felt her absolute tactical desire to shred the approaching predators into ribbons, a martial fury so potent it made his own blood sing. Sylth gasped aloud, her eyes widening in shock. She felt his sheer terror washing over her like a freezing tide. But beneath it, she felt a rigid, analytical calm. It was a mind rapidly categorizing the predator's movement patterns, muscle structures, and center of gravity. The empathic feedback loop was startling, an unintended, profound side effect of the sustained biological neutralization bridging their nervous systems. Driven by her sudden surge of borrowed adrenaline and Elias's tactical observations feeding directly into her consciousness, Sylth used the human's grip as leverage. She hauled her massive frame upright, her muscles straining against the dead weight of the biomechanical suit. She could not use her armor's energy weapons, but she was still a Xylari warrior forged in a culture of relentless combat. She reached down and ripped a heavy, jagged metal strut from the closest destroyed drone, wielding it like a crude but lethal broadsword. They had to move. They had to back away into the deeper, winding tunnels of the Undercity to funnel the predators into a choke point. To do that, they had to move perfectly in sync. Two vastly different species bound together by a glowing tether of accidental empathy and the mutual desperate need to not be eaten alive in the dark. As they took their first synchronized step backward, a massive rhythmic tremor shook the ground beneath their feet, far heavier than any blind beast. Something enormous had just breached the upper access chute they had fallen through, and the heavy metallic clang of its descent suggested it was carrying military-grade ordnance. Survival in the subterranean dark requires more than just sharp weapons and quick reflexes. It requires the impossible task of trusting the enemy. For a terrified human botanist and a poisoned alien queen, the true danger was no longer the monstrous predators lurking in the shadows, but the terrifying, undeniable intimacy growing rapidly between them. The massive rhythmic tremor that had shaken the cavern floor provided their only avenue of escape. The sheer acoustic violence of the heavy metal impact echoing down the vertical chute sent the pack of blind subterranean predators scattering into the deeper crevices of the Undercity. Seizing the momentary distraction, Sylth hauled Elias to his feet. Driven by the shared empathic surge of pure survival instinct, they moved as a single awkward organism into the winding claustrophobic maintenance tunnels branching off from the main vault. They navigated the pitch-black labyrinth for what felt like hours, guided only by the ambient ghostly glow of bioluminescent moss and the pulsing pale blue light bridging their connected hands. Finally, they discovered a structural blind spot. It was a collapsed atmospheric processing hub, hidden entirely behind a thick calcified waterfall of luminous fungi. It offered a single entry point, heavy stone cover, and a tactical vantage point overlooking the main tunnel. It was a perfect, defensible camp. Sylth collapsed against the curved, rusted wall of the processing unit, her biomechanical armor groaning under her dead weight. The whisper root toxin was nearly purged from her system, neutralized by the relentless, chaotic chemistry of Elias's bare skin, but the physiological toll was massive. She was entirely spent. She finally released her bone-crushing grip on Elias's wrist, but the moment the physical connection broke, a sharp, ragged gasp tore from her throat. The violet veins of her armor flickered wildly, threatening to plunge her back into the deep slumber. Elias did not run. He did not step away, operating on an instinct he did not fully understand. He immediately slid down the curved wall beside her and pressed his bare palm flat against the exposed pale scales at the base of her neck. The pale blue light flared brilliantly, washing away the sickly gray of the failing stasis. Sylth let out a long, shuddering breath, her muscles uncoiling. It was a purely pragmatic tether, a biological necessity to keep her heart beating. but sitting shoulder to shoulder in the glowing dark, the absolute physical proximity felt incredibly intimate. "You have terrible hospitality on this planet," Elias said, his voice a dry, exhausted rasp. Sylph turned her massive, crested head to look at him. Her golden, slit-pupiled eyes narrowed, her highly logical brain struggling to parse the statement. Then, the empathic link connecting their nervous systems hummed. She felt a distinct alien sensation wash over her consciousness. It was a specific flavor of human coping mechanism, a deflective absurdity designed to manage overwhelming terror. She felt his humor. A tiny, almost imperceptible scoff vibrated in her chest. "The Xylari do not build our catacombs for the comfort of uninvited agriculturalists." Elias Vance. It was the first time she had used his name. The sound of it, shaped by her raspy, metallic vocal cords, sent a strange shiver down his spine. They sat in the quiet, the silence broken only by the steady drip of condensation and the rhythmic, synchronized pulsing of the blue light between them. The adrenaline of the chase was fading, leaving behind a raw, unfiltered vulnerability. They began to talk. It started as a cautious exchange of tactical information, but quickly dissolved into a profound, revealing exploration of two wildly different universes. Elias spoke of his life on Earth, of sprawling, messy greenhouses filled with mutated ferns and aggressive ivy. He explained the concept of a human ecosystem, where things grew over each other, competing for sunlight, adapting to flaws, and creating a chaotic, imperfect beauty. He described a society built on compromise, loud debates, and the fundamental right to be completely, unapologetically wrong. Sylph listened with intense, unblinking focus. The concept of deliberate imperfection was entirely alien to her. She spoke of the Xylari homeworld, of grand, symmetrical cities carved from obsidian and hyperglass. She described the royal gardens of her palace, where every single leaf and petal was genetically modified for absolute, unwavering perfection. Any flora that deviated from the master design was immediately pruned and incinerated. "It sounds exhausting," Elias murmured, his thumb absent-mindedly tracing a ridge on her cold armor. "Demanding perfection from everything you touch." Sylph looked down at their joined hands. The blue light illuminated the stark contrast between his soft, pink skin and her rigid indigo scales. "It is not a demand, Elias. It is a survival imperative. The Xylari respect only the unbreakable. To show a flaw is to invite the blade." She leaned her head back against the rusted metal wall, the heavy armor clanking dully. The empathic link between them surged, carrying a wave of emotion so profound it made Elias's chest ache. He felt an agonizing, crushing weight pressing down on her spirit. It was the suffocating isolation of the throne, the constant paranoid calculus of ruling a society of apex predators. "My armor is a marvel of engineering," Sylph whispered, her voice losing its imperial edge, becoming soft and startlingly philosophic. "It enhances my strength, accelerates my cognition, and projects absolute invulnerability. But it is also a cage. I cannot remove it. To stand unarmored before my people is to admit I am flesh, and flesh can be cut." Vorek knew this. Elias felt her pain. It was not just the physical ache of the poison, it was the sharp, jagged agony of profound betrayal. She had elevated Vorek, trusted his counsel, and he had orchestrated her murder in front of the entire galaxy simply because he believed her willingness to negotiate with Earth made her weak. "He thinks you are brittle," Elias said, leaning slightly closer. "He thinks because you bend toward peace, you will break. But he is wrong. A tree that cannot bend in a storm snaps. The ones that survive are the ones that yield to the wind." Sylph turned to him, her golden eyes wide. the cultural conditioning of a lifetime warring against the absolute, undeniable truth radiating from the human beside her. Through the empathic tether, she felt his complete lack of malice. He was physically weak, terrified, and hopelessly out of his depth, yet he possessed a deep, nurturing resilience that defied all Xylari logic. He did not want to conquer her. He wanted to heal her. She realized, with a sudden, startling clarity, that this fragile, insignificant botanist was the strongest entity she had ever encountered. The romantic tension in the small, luminous alcove became a physical weight. Elias felt a surge of awe and raw attraction radiating from the terrifying queen, a magnetic pull that completely overrode his survival instincts. He looked at the sharp, lethal angles of her face, softened by the blue glow, and realized he was falling for a woman who could crush his skull with 2 fingers. Sylth leaned in, the rigid crest of her head tilting, entirely captivated by the alien warmth and profound empathy of the man who held her life in his bare hand. They were inches apart, the boundaries between human and Xylari completely dissolving in the dark. Then a harsh, piercing beam of red tactical light swept violently across the cavern wall outside their sanctuary. The heavy, rhythmic stomping of reinforced combat boots echoed down the main tunnel, accompanied by the high-pitched, vibrating whine of active plasma rifles. Vorek's elite hunting squads had breached the Undercity. They were not blind beasts. They were highly trained, crimson-armored executioners, moving with lethal, disciplined precision. They were executing a sweeping grid-by-grid purge of the sector, and their thermal energy scanners were sweeping directly toward the collapsed maintenance hub. Elias felt Sylth's muscles instantly lock into rigid, combat-ready steel. The quiet intimacy vanished, replaced by the freezing, brutal reality of an impending firefight. They had no weapons. Her armor was dead, and the death squad was 50 yards away and closing fast. There is a vast, lethal difference between being stalked by hungry beasts and being hunted by trained professionals. Beasts rely on instinct and scent, but professionals rely on sweeping thermal optics that can register the heat of a terrified human heartbeat through 2 feet of solid stone. Elias and Sylth were trapped in a dead end. The crimson-armored death squad was advancing down the narrow corridor in a perfect, overlapping tactical formation. Their plasma rifles painted the walls with harsh red lasers, cutting through the gloom. Elias could feel Sylth's pulse skyrocketing through the empathic tether still binding their hands. Her combat instincts were screaming at her to charge, to meet death on her feet with her claws bared, because a Xylari monarch did not cower in the dirt. But her biomechanical armor was a dead weight, and a frontal assault would end in immediate vaporization. Elias squeezed her hand, a desperate, anchoring pressure. Through the pale blue light connecting their skin, he projected a single, commanding thought. Stay absolutely still. He did not have a weapon, but he had an entire, unmapped ecosystem at his disposal. His eyes darted frantically around the perimeter of their collapsed sanctuary, analyzing the overgrown flora clinging to the damp stone. He ignored the glowing moss and the creeping vines, his gaze locking onto a dense cluster of bulbous, translucent fungal pods hanging from the low ceiling directly over the corridor's choke point. On Earth, a similar species was known colloquially as a puffball mushroom, harmlessly dispersing reproductive dust when stepped upon. Here, in the hyper-competitive, lethal environment of the Xylari Undercity, the biology was vastly more aggressive. Elias recognized the distinct veined membrane of the pods from a classified Terran intelligence briefing on Xylari hazardous environments. They were pressure-sensitive biological mines, filled with microscopic, highly caustic spores designed to digest heavy metals and hardened exoskeletons. He leaned close to Sylth, his lips brushing the edge of her inert metallic shoulder. He kept his voice to an absolute, breathless whisper. He told her exactly what the hanging pods were, and he told her exactly what he needed her to do. Sylth's golden eyes widened. To use the environment as a weapon, to rely on dirt and fungi instead of forged steel and plasma, was deeply offensive to her warrior caste upbringing. It was the tactic of a scavenger. But as the heavy, synchronized footsteps of the execution squad echoed just 30 yards away, she felt the unshakable, terrifying confidence radiating from Elias. He was not guessing. He knew exactly how this alien ecosystem functioned. With agonizing slowness, Sylth reached down with her free hand and curled her thick, scaled fingers around a jagged chunk of rusted iron piping resting on the floor. The metal was heavy, but even without her armor's power assist, her base physical strength was formidable. She checked the weight, her muscles coiling like a struck spring. The Crimson Squad reached the choke point. The lead hunter raised his hand, signaling a halt. His helmet swept toward the calcified waterfall of luminous fungi concealing Elias and Sylth. The thermal scanner had registered their body heat. The hunter slowly leveled his plasma rifle directly at the center of their sanctuary. "Now," Elias breathed. Sylth surged upward from her crouch. Ignoring the screaming protest of her dead armor, she hurled the heavy iron pipe with devastating, calculated precision. The heavy metal projectile struck the central cluster of translucent pods with crushing force. The biological reaction was instantaneous and violently catastrophic. The entire colony of pods detonated simultaneously with a deafening, concussive rupture of compressed gas. A massive, billowing cloud of thick, glowing green spores flooded the narrow corridor, instantly swallowing the execution squad. The hunters immediately opened fire in a blind panic, sending random plasma bolts scorching into the stone walls. But the searing heat of their weapons only accelerated the trap. The hyper-aggressive spores sought out the nearest sources of thermal energy and refined metal. They sucked directly into the intake vents of the crimson armor, immediately going to work. The results were horrifyingly rapid. The advanced microcircuitry of the Xylari tactical suits began to dissolve. The glowing green dust ate through joint seals and optical sensors in a matter of seconds. The hunters dropped their rifles as the weapons short-circuited and fused into useless, sparking slag. The squad commander tore at his helmet, choking as the caustic spores breached his atmospheric scrubbers, filling his lungs with a localized, flesh-eating rot. Within 30 seconds, the corridor was a graveyard of writhing, incapacitated elite killers. Their state-of-the-art technology completely undone by a pocket of subterranean mold. Sylth stared at the carnage, completely breathless. She had spent her entire life believing that absolute strength was defined by impenetrable armor and superior firepower. Yet here was a fragile human, a man who winced when he bumped his knee, who had just decimated a squad of her deadliest assassins using nothing but a rock and a profound understanding of how things grew. Elias tugged on her hand, breaking her shock. They could not stay. The ambient heat from the plasma discharges would soon attract the blind predators they had evaded earlier. They slipped quietly past the groaning, writhing hunters, moving deeper into the labyrinth. The tunnel widened, the rough-hewn stone giving way to smooth, ancient geometric architecture. They had stumbled into an old administrative sector, a forgotten nerve center of the original city. At the center of a dust-choked rotunda sat a massive circular console, its crystalline interface dark and dormant. It was a primary communications relay. Sylth approached the console, dragging Elias with her. She brushed a thick layer of corrosive dust away from a biometric scanner panel. If the underground network is isolated from the modern grid above, Vorex slicers may not have disconnected it. She rasped. She pressed her bare, scaled palm against the scanner. Nothing happened. The machine was starved of power, its internal reserves drained centuries ago. Elias looked at the pale blue light still softly pulsing between their joined hands. He realized the light was not just a chemical reaction neutralizing poison. It was a potent bioelectric charge, a literal bridge of living energy generated by their contrasting biologies. Without asking for permission, he stepped forward and slammed his free hand directly over Sylph's hand resting on the scanner. The reaction was explosive. The blue light surged from their connected skin, arcing violently across the crystalline surface of the console. The ancient machine drank the biological energy, groaning as century-old capacitors forcefully re-engaged. A massive, flickering holographic projection crackled to life in the center of the rotunda. The image stabilized, revealing the grand negotiation chamber they had fled earlier. The room was packed with the Xylari High Council and the remaining, thoroughly terrified Terran diplomats. Standing at the central podium, bathed in a solitary, dramatic spotlight, was High Minister Vorek. He looked solemn, his crimson silks impeccably arranged. He raised his clawed hands, demanding silence. "My brothers and sisters of the Empire," Vorek proclaimed, his deep voice carrying a masterful, utterly fake tremor of grief. "It is with a shattered heart that I confirm the tragedy. Our beloved Queen Sylph is dead." A murmur of staged shock rippled through the assembled council members. The Terran assassin utilized a localized, highly volatile spatial distortion device. Vorek continued smoothly, weaving a flawless, impossible lie. "He dragged our matriarch into the structural void beneath this station. My elite retrieval teams have scoured the depths. They found only the catastrophic residue of the weapon. There is nothing left to recover." Sylph stood frozen, watching her own eulogy being delivered by her murderer. Her grip on Elias's hand tightened to the point of pain. "In this time of unprecedented chaos, we cannot show weakness," Vorek bellowed, his voice rising in manufactured passion. "The Terran delegation will be held accountable, but our immediate survival demands stability. By the ancient right of succession, and to honor the memory of the fallen queen, I accept the burden of the crown. The coronation will commence in 1 hour." The hologram sputtered and died as the temporary bioelectric charge faded, plunging the rotunda back into heavy shadows. Sylph stared at the empty air. The moral lesson of her entire ordeal crystallized with brutal clarity. Her empire was not a fortress. It was a fragile construct held together by fear and rigid obedience. Vorek was exploiting that exact rigidity. He knew the council would accept a strong lie over a complicated truth because their culture lacked the flexibility to question absolute authority. Strength was not just physical dominance. It was the ability to adapt. It was the capacity to form unexpected alliances. It was the willingness to trust. Qualities her society had actively purged for 1,000 years. 1 hour, Elias said quietly into the darkness. If he gets that crown on his head, his authority becomes absolute. Your loyalists won't be able to touch him without starting a civil war. We are trapped in a tomb, Sylph replied, her voice stripped of all imperial arrogance, leaving only a profound, terrifying vulnerability. The main elevators are sealed. The perimeter is guarded. We cannot reach the throne room in an hour. Elias turned back to the darkened console. While the hologram had been playing, his eyes had been scanning the flickering environmental schematics running along the lower edge of the display. He was a botanist, and he knew that plants, regardless of their origin, required specific, massive infrastructure to survive inside an artificial space station. He pointed a trembling finger at a massive vertical conduit mapped on the dead screen. You said your royal gardens on the surface demand absolute perfection. They demand vast amounts of filtered water and climate-controlled air. He looked at the Queen, a reckless, desperate grin spreading across his face. We don't need an elevator. We just need to climb the plumbing. Climbing a mile-high alien plumbing pipe is an excellent way to realize exactly how fragile the human body really is. When that pipe leads directly into a hostile coup, the fragility becomes an immediate, pressing liability. The ascent through the primary environmental conduit was a grueling, agonizing test of endurance. Elias and Sylth hauled themselves upward through the dark, massive vertical shaft, deafened by the roar of filtered water rushing through adjacent mains. The pale blue light bridging their connected hands remained their only lifeline. Without Elias's constant physical contact, the toxic residue of the whisper root would instantly plunge the Queen back into a fatal stasis. The sheer dead weight of her biomechanical armor threatened to drag them both into the abyss with every slick, treacherous handhold. Elias's muscles screamed, his fingers bloodied and torn against the heavy iron grating. He could feel Sylth's exhaustion bleeding through their empathic tether, a heavy, suffocating wave of physical depletion that perfectly mirrored his own. Yet, beneath the fatigue, he felt her iron-forged willpower. She refused to die in the dark. Driven by that shared, desperate resolve, they finally reached a massive circular outflow grate that smelled sharply of synthesized ozone and heavily manicured soil. With a final joint heave, they shoved the heavy grate aside and tumbled out onto a bed of soft, immaculate violet moss. They had breached the royal botanical gardens of Aegis Prime. The contrast to the decaying undercity was violently disorienting. Above them, a sprawling dome of transparent aluminum showcased a tapestry of glittering stars. The air was perfectly temperature-controlled, carrying the engineered fragrance of 1,000 exotic, blooming flowers. Every single obsidian planter was aligned with geometric precision. Every hyper-engineered orchid was flawless, suspended in a state of unnatural, perpetual bloom. As a botanist, Elias felt a profound professional disgust. It was a sterile, lifeless perfection, an ecosystem held hostage by an obsessive need for control. It was the exact ideology that had driven Vorek to treason. He helped Sylth to her feet. She swayed heavily, her inert armor scraping against the pristine obsidian walkways. Her golden eyes swept the manicured landscape, instantly mapping a tactical route through the dense, symmetrical foliage. They needed to reach the amphitheater before the coronation concluded, but they had to do it completely undetected. As they moved silently through the shadows of towering violet-leaved ferns, Elias spotted a polished silver maintenance cart tucked behind a decorative hedgerow. His eyes darted over the neatly organized horticultural supplies. He recognized the chemical markers on a heavy pressurized cylinder strapped to the side of the cart. It was a highly concentrated weapons-grade rapid cellular accelerator. The Xylari used it to force their ornamental flora into immediate, unnatural maturity. In human terms, it was plant steroids cranked to a catastrophically volatile extreme. Elias grabbed the heavy cylinder with his free hand, his mind already calculating the volatile chemistry. Through the dense canopy, the towering glass walls of the main negotiation chamber came into view. The political theater was in its final, triumphant act. High Minister Vorek stood atop the grand dais, bathed in brilliant white light. The Terran delegation was corralled in the lower tiers, surrounded by crimson-armored enforcers with their weapons drawn. A terrifyingly ornate crown, forged from jagged obsidian and pulsing red gemstones, was being carried toward Vorek on a ceremonial velvet cushion. He raised his clawed hands, a smug, victorious sneer plastered across his reptilian features as he prepared to accept absolute authority over 3 billion human lives. The question of how to bypass the heavily guarded blast doors was answered by the Queen's royal blood. Sylth led Elias to a completely seamless section of the transparent aluminum wall overlooking the dais. It was a sovereign's private viewing pane, invisible to the public eye. She pressed her bare, scaled palm against the glass. The biometric sensors, recognizing the genetic signature of the true matriarch, instantly dissolved the solid barrier with a rush of pressurized air. They stepped out of the garden and directly onto the elevated rear platform of the grand dais. The visual impact of their arrival hit the room like a physical shockwave. The coronation abruptly halted. Absolute breathless silence slammed into the amphitheater. Every eye turned to the raised platform. They did not see the pristine, untouchable God Queen they remembered. They saw a battered, filthy survivor. Sylth's regal crest was caked in subterranean mud, her legendary armor dead and entirely devoid of light. Yet, she stood upright, anchored firmly to the side of the rumpled, bruised Terran botanist, the pale blue bioelectric tether pulsing brightly between their joined hands was the most alien, impossible sight the Xylari court had ever witnessed. Ambassador Thorne's jaw dropped completely slack. High Minister Vorek's smug sneer vanished, replaced by a mask of raw, unfiltered panic. The ghost of his murdered sovereign had just walked out of the botanical gardens holding hands with a human. Treason! Vorek shrieked, his composure shattering entirely. He pointed a trembling finger at the dais. It is a Terran trick, a biological abomination. Kill them both immediately. The crimson-armored enforcers raised their kinetic rifles, their targeting lasers sweeping up toward Elias and Sylth. Commander Kalen did not hesitate. The stoic, heavily scarred warrior had spent the last hour consumed by the agonizing suspicion of a coup. Now, seeing his queen breathing, seeing the undeniable proof of the human's intervention radiating in that pulsing blue light, his absolute loyalty crystallized. Kalen roared a battle command that shook the polished stone walls. He slammed the butt of his plasma halberd against the floor, stepping directly into the line of fire. The matriarch lives! Death to the usurper! The amphitheater erupted into absolute chaos. Kalen's loyalist guards turned their weapons on Vorek's crimson enforcers. Searing bolts of superheated plasma crisscrossed the pristine white room, scorching the tapestries and shattering the crystal negotiation tables. The Terran diplomats dove for cover behind the heavy stone benches as the elite Xylari warriors engaged in brutal, close-quarters combat. Realizing he was losing the room and his absolute power was slipping through his claws, Vorek abandoned all pretense of political theater. He reached to his ceremonial belt and activated a heavy-duty military-grade kinetic energy shield. A shimmering, translucent dome of golden energy snapped into existence around his massive frame, instantly deflecting a barrage of loyalist plasma fire. Drawing a long, jagged executioner's blade from his sash, Vorek turned his murderous gaze toward the rear platform. He bypassed the firefight entirely, marching up the steps toward Sylth. If he severed her head, the loyalist rebellion would instantly collapse. Sylth tried to push Elias behind her, her warrior instincts flaring, but her dead armor anchored her to the floor. She was completely exhausted, barely able to keep her balance, let alone fight a fully shielded, enraged warlord. Elias stepped forward, planting his feet firmly between the terrifying queen and the advancing high minister. He felt Sylth's raw panic surge through their empathic link, a desperate plea for him to run. He ignored it. He gripped the heavy pressurized cylinder of rapid cellular accelerator in his right hand. He understood the physics of energy shields. They were specifically calibrated to repel high-velocity energy weapons and dense, fast-moving solid mass. They were not calibrated to recognize a localized, non-hostile biological hazard. Vorek laughed, a cruel booming sound as he raised the jagged blade above his head, preparing to cleave the fragile human in two. Elias twisted the heavy brass pressure valve entirely off the cylinder. He did not throw the canister at Vorek's chest. He hurled it straight down, directly at the High Minister's feet. The heavy cylinder shattered against the polished stone floor, right on top of the decorative ornamental vines deeply woven into the architecture of the grand dais. A massive puddle of concentrated, volatile hyperstimulant splashed across the alien flora, soaking the roots in pure, unfiltered biological rocket fuel. The reaction was immediate and violently catastrophic. The ornamental vines underwent a massive, explosive genetic mutation. Driven by the hyper-accelerator, the dormant plant life erupted upward with the force of a detonating bomb. A colossal writhing tangle of thick, woody biomass tore through the polished stone floorboards, expanding at a terrifying, unnatural speed. The explosive organic growth slammed directly into the interior of Vorek's kinetic shield. The shield's frequency matrix was completely unprepared to calculate the sudden, overwhelming expansion of localized biomass from beneath its protective dome. The conflicting physical pressure and the rapid, unrelenting cellular growth violently overloaded the shield's internal generators. With a blinding, concussive flash of white light, Vorek's golden energy shield shattered into a million dissipating sparks. The High Minister stumbled backward, completely stunned by the concussive force and entangled in the thick, mutating vines. He dropped his executioner's blade, his eyes wide with disbelief as he stared at the human who had just weaponized a decorative floor piece. Sylph did not waste the opening. Tapping into the final, agonizing reserves of her innate Xylari strength. She lunged forward. She bypassed the tangled vines, her heavy armored shoulder slamming squarely into Vorek's chest. The impact drove the massive High Minister backward, sending him crashing violently to the floor. Sylph planted her heavy metallic knee firmly on Vorek's throat, her claws extending to rest millimeters from his jugular. The amphitheater abruptly fell silent. The Crimson Enforcers, seeing their leader pinned and defeated by the resurrected queen, dropped their weapons in immediate surrender. Commander Kalen signaled his loyalists to secure the prisoners. The battle was over. The throne was secured. But as Elias stood breathless amidst the shattered stone and overgrown vines, he realized the political and cultural shockwave of a human orchestrating a royal rescue was just beginning to hit the galaxy. The quickest way to rewrite 3 centuries of rigid galactic foreign policy is not through endless diplomatic negotiation, but by weaponizing a decorative ficus against a treasonous warlord. The immediate aftermath, however, required significantly more paperwork and a complete overhaul of the Terran-Xylari Treaty. High Minister Vorek did not die in the throne room. To kill him would have been a quick, honorable warrior's death, a privilege Queen Sylph explicitly denied him. Instead, as the heavy, mutated vines pinned him to the polished stone, Commander Kalen stepped forward, his massive plasma halberd powered down. With methodical, terrifying precision, Kalen stripped Vorek of his crimson ceremonial silks and his High Council insignia, officially declaring him a traitor to the matriarch. Vorek was dragged away in heavy iron restraints, screaming hollow threats that echoed uselessly off the shattered glass of the amphitheater. The political shockwave was instantaneous. The remaining members of the Xylari High Council, who had been fully prepared to bow to a usurper 5 minutes prior, suddenly found themselves staring at their resurrected queen. Sylph was covered in subterranean mud, leaning heavily on a rumpled human botanist, and radiating a cold, furious authority that did not require a single piece of biomechanical armor to enforce. Ambassador Thorne and the Terran delegation emerged slowly from behind the overturned stone benches, dusting off their tailored suits, their faces pale with shock. They had fully expected to be executed as scapegoats. Instead, they watched as Queen Sylph, still holding Elias Vance's hand, demanded the immediate ratification of the peace treaty. The terms were aggressively amended on the spot. Earth was no longer considered a chaotic buffer zone to be tolerated or conquered. Humanity was officially designated a strategic partner to the Xylari Empire. Furthermore, Sylph mandated an unprecedented cultural and agricultural exchange program. decreeing that Terran adaptability and biological ingenuity were resources the rigid Xylari society desperately needed to study. Elias, still running on pure adrenaline and nursing a profoundly bruised tailbone, found himself standing at the epicenter of galactic history. He was entirely exhausted, desperate for a shower, and deeply confused by the sudden, terrifying shift in the room's dynamic. This confusion peaked an hour later when the adrenaline finally crashed. Elias was sitting in a plush, velvet-lined chair in a secure anteroom while Xylari medical technicians carefully separated his hand from the Queen's. The whisper root toxin was officially declared eradicated from her system. As the technicians departed, Commander Kalen entered the room. The towering, heavily scarred warrior did not sneer, nor did he look at Elias with the predatory disdain common to his species. Instead, Kalen stopped 3 feet away, stood at rigid attention, and bowed his massive crested head in a gesture of absolute, profound reverence. The Empire owes you a debt that cannot be measured in credits or territory. Elias Vance, Kalen rumbled, his deep voice devoid of any previous hostility. You navigated the abyss. You turned the Earth itself into a weapon against the usurper. Your combat tactics are entirely dishonorable, completely lacking in martial grace, and undeniably magnificent. Kalen reached to his heavy utility belt and unclasped a ceremonial jagged obsidian dagger. He offered it to Elias, holding the blade flat across his palms. If any member of the High Council or the Ministry ever questions your presence on this station, show them this. They will know you carry the absolute protection of the Royal Guard. We will stand between you and the stars. Elias stared at the lethal, terrifying weapon, then looked up at the 8-foot-tall apex predator who was treating him like a legendary war god. He carefully took the dagger, his exhausted brain struggling to process the reality that he now had a personal army of giant alien bodyguards. He thanked the commander politely, mentally deciding to use the priceless ceremonial weapon to prune his prize-winning hydrangeas back in Ohio. Order was restored with brutal efficiency over the next 48 hours. The Loyalists purged Vorek's remaining conspirators from the ministry. The Terran diplomats secured their borders and finalized the trade routes, constantly side-eyeing Elias, unsure how a mid-level xenobotanist had accidentally conquered the Xylari Queen. On the evening before the Terran delegation was scheduled to depart for Earth, Elias was summoned to the Royal Residential Wing. The heavy blast doors slid open, revealing a sprawling, dimly lit chamber overlooking the glittering expanse of the cosmos. The room was devoid of the rigid, symmetrical perfection that defined the rest of the palace. Instead, the floor was covered in soft, woven tapestries, and the air smelled faintly of burning cedar and exotic spices. Sylth stood near the massive viewing window. She was no longer encased in the terrifying obsidian biomechanical armor. She wore a simple, flowing robe of deep indigo silk that draped elegantly over her tall, powerful frame. Without the heavy metal suit and the rigid cranial plating, she looked strangely softer, yet no less imposing. Her pale scales caught the starlight, and her golden eyes locked onto Elias the moment he entered. "You are leaving," she said, her raspy, metallic voice echoing quietly in the vast room. It was not a question. Elias stepped forward, the plush tapestries muffling his footsteps. "My contract with the diplomatic corps is up. The treaty is signed. Ambassador Thorne wants me back on Earth before I accidentally cause another galactic incident by watering the wrong plant." Sylth turned fully toward him. The rigid cultural boundaries that had separated them for days were completely gone. "I have officially requested a Terran liaison to oversee the new agricultural integration program. I specifically mandated that the liaison must possess a profound understanding of chaotic ecosystems, an utter disregard for Xylari military protocol, and a deeply annoying habit of being right." A slow, tired smile spread across Elias's face. That is a highly specific job description. Your Majesty. It is a necessary one, Sylth replied, closing the distance between them. She stopped mere inches away, her imposing height forcing Elias to tilt his head back slightly. She reached out with a bare, scaled hand. Elias did not hesitate. He raised his own hand, meeting her palm in the space between them. There was no whisper root poison left to neutralize. There was no desperate, biological imperative keeping them alive. Yet the moment their skin touched, a soft, warm, pale blue light bloomed between their fingers. Elias gasped softly. The empathic tether had not faded with the toxin. It was permanent, a bridge of pure energy forged in the dark depths of the Undercity. He felt a sudden, rushing wave of emotion wash over his consciousness. He felt her profound relief, her quiet, lingering fear of the vulnerability she was embracing, and a deep, undeniable affection that completely bypassed language. "The armor is gone," Sylth whispered, her golden eyes softening as she felt his awe radiating back through their shared connection. "Vorek was right about one thing. I am flesh. And flesh can be wounded, but you taught me that to survive, one must be willing to bend." "Bending is how things grow," Elias murmured, his fingers curling gently around hers. He felt the terrifying, beautiful weight of the future settling over them. He was a human botanist standing in the private chambers of an alien sovereign, holding a hand that could crush a boulder, and he had never felt safer in his entire life. The universe was vast, chaotic, and endlessly dangerous, but as they stood together bathed in the soft blue light of their shared empathy, Elias knew they possessed the one thing that could weather any storm. They had a root system that could not be broken. Thank you so much for watching this story to the very end. If you enjoyed this blend of sci-fi adventure, political intrigue, and unexpected romance, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new tale. Share this video with a fellow sci-fi fan and drop down into the comments and leave the word "bloom" so I know you made it all the way through. And do not forget to smash that hype button so this video can reach more viewers just like you. Until next time, keep looking to the stars.